Nietzsche famously declared that Dostoevsky was the only psychologist from whom he had anything to learn. But his discovery of Dostoevsky's works was the result of a complete accident, and Nietzsche's first acquaintance with Dostoevsky's work was troubled by translation errors and questionable choices made by incompetent book publishers. This is the story of how Nietzsche accidentally discovered Dostoevsky. Much has been written about the overlap in ideas and philosophy between Nietzsche on the one hand and Dostoevsky on the other. But what is easy to overlook in these discussions is that the historical reality of how Nietzsche first came into contact with Dostoevsky's works is riddled with historical contingencies. For example, Nietzsche probably never had a chance to read Crime and Punishment, and even if he did, it was after he wrote the bulk of his books. And he certainly didn't read the brothers Karamazov, because that work was left untranslated by the time that Nietzsche became incapacitated. This leaves Nietzsche completely unaware of arguably the two most important works by Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky is only barely mentioned in his works as well, because Nietzsche discovered him only late in life when he had already written the bulk of his books. There is one explicit mention in Twilight of the Idols, where Nietzsche talks about the House of the Dead in a passage discussing the psychology of the criminal. And some people see in a passage in The Antichrist a reference to Dostoevsky's novel The Idiot. But this leaves us with a lot of uncertainty. What we do know for sure is that Nietzsche discovered Dostoevsky completely by accident while traveling in France. The year is 1878. Nietzsche was living in Nice, and one day he found himself in a bookshop. A French book caught his eye, a translated work of Russian literature by an author he was unfamiliar with at the time, a fellow by name of Fyodor Dostoevsky. People will tell you that he happened upon Dostoevsky's landmark existentialist novel, Notes from the Underground. But they are wrong. Let me explain why. Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground is a story, or rather a psychological deep dive, into the moral world of its nameless protagonist, the underground man. But the book Nietzsche found in that bookshop was not Notes from the Underground. At least, not really. The book was entitled L'Esprit Souterrain, which, if you speak some French, should remind you of Notes from the Underground. But that's not the entire story. You see, in the 19th century, publishers weren't quite as strict with matters of translation as they are today. And the French edition of Notes from the Underground that Nietzsche discovered was actually a botched French translation of two different Dostoevsky works thrown together by the translator and turned into one book, thus completely ruining the content of both works. The French translator mixed up two different stories of Dostoevsky and presented them as if they were one. There is Notes from the Underground, the book we talked about already, and also The Landlady, a little-known novel by Dostoevsky in which a protagonist named Ordinov falls in love with a woman named Katerina. What the translator did was put these two works right next to each other, and crucially, he added his own writings in between them, impersonating Dostoevsky himself and thereby presenting these two different works as one novel. Obviously, this goes completely against Dostoevsky's artistic intent. This completely changes the meaning of both novels, because by putting them together as one, Ordinov, the protagonist from the novel The Landlady, now also turns into the nameless protagonist from Notes of the Underground, the elusive underground man. This is a complete violation of what Dostoevsky intended. The anonymity of the underground man is actually one of the most important aspects of the novel. In other words, the translator is impersonating Dostoevsky and writing in his name, with you, the reader, being none the wiser. You could call it a case of stolen identity. Now, if you want to protect yourself from identity theft, then look no further than NordVPN, this video's sponsor. Much like sketchy 19th century French translators of Russian literature, bad actors online often insert themselves where they're not wanted. For example, If you're often on public Wi-Fi, there is a good chance you accidentally log into a malicious evil twin network, thereby giving these criminals your sensitive data if you visit unencrypted websites. Stay safe online and protect your data from cybercriminals by using a VPN for your online activities. NordVPN encrypts your data and keeps you safe. Use the link nordvpn.com/Weltgeist for an exclusive deal where you get 4 months of additional protection for free on a 2-year plan, and you also get a 30-day money-back guarantee. They also have a dark web monitor that continuously monitors the dark web for data leaks and immediately alerts you if your details are up for sale, so you can take swift action. NordVPN also has built-in threat protection that scans files for malware and blocks links that lead to malicious websites to increase your safety while browsing the web. Become safer online with a single click and enjoy an encrypted browsing experience with the fastest VPN on the planet. They currently offer an exclusive deal with 4 free extra months on a 2-year plan and a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try out NordVPN risk-free by going to nordvpn.com/Weltgeist or clicking the link in the description. Thanks again to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. And now, let's get back to Nietzsche. So the thing to keep in mind here is that Nietzsche knew about Dostoevsky, yes, but only in a roundabout way, through a book that he assumed was one complete work, but which actually consisted of 2 separate stories connected by the original writings of the translator. Nietzsche describes this accidental discovery of Dostoevsky as a revelation. He found his book completely by chance in a bookshop, and he found within its pages a psychologist of the first rank, someone from whom Nietzsche had a thing or two to learn. But we have to keep in mind that Nietzsche read a different book than what we know today as Notes from the Underground, especially because Notes from the Underground is nowadays a much more famous work than House of the Dead, the only other Dostoevsky book that Nietzsche explicitly mentions in his writings. And this unauthorized conjoining of The Landlady and Notes from the Underground did have an influence on how Nietzsche understood Dostoevsky and his work. Let's dig a little deeper. Just how much did the translators butcher Dostoevsky's work? As it turns out, quite a bit. The first part of L'Esprit Souterrain is basically the integral text of the novel The Landlady. Of course, again, Nietzsche didn't know he was reading an entirely different novel from what we would call Notes of the Underground today. So even if the translation of The Landlady is fine, we can't forget that it's a translation of a totally different novel in the first place. And then we have the second part of L'Esprit Souterrain. Ostensibly, this is a translation of what we would call Notes from the Underground. But the translator has omitted a lot of material from the source text. A lot. Most notably, the translator didn't think it was necessary to include specifically the philosophical parts of the novel, because he wanted to focus on the plot and on the action, and he called the philosophy bits boring, and he thought that it would turn off the French audience from enjoying the novel. In one particular case, for example, the translator just completely removed 8 pages of the original novel and didn't include them in his translation. But the worst part is not what is removed from the text, but what is added to it. As mentioned previously, the translator wanted to make these 2 separate stories into one cohesive whole. But you can't just paste the 2 novels together like that. If you want to turn the 2 stories into one, there needs to be a transition between the 2 texts so that the stories make sense as one continuous storyline. And that's what the translator did. Crucially, in grouping these 2 stories together and writing a bridge between them, the translator changes the protagonist from Notes from the Underground. In the original, the underground man remains nameless, because Dostoevsky intended him to be a typical representation of a certain type of man in Russian society at the time, someone the reader could identify with. Now, in this new rendition, the protagonist gets a name and a psychological background story that was simply not present in the original. The protagonist from The Landlady, a typical young, hopeless romantic named Ordinov, is now also the underground man. But this changes the character on a deep, fundamental level. The whole novel now follows a very cliched character arc. Ordinov, the protagonist, undergoes a transformation from hopeless romantic to misanthropic cynic. We know from letters to friends that Nietzsche was especially impressed with the second part of L'Esprit Souterrain, which would correspond with Notes from the Underground, and not with The Landlady. But because of the editing of the text by the translator, certain aspects of the novel change their meaning, and Nietzsche's interpretation of Dostoevsky would have to change as a result. But interestingly enough, this interpretation, based on an edited text, probably worked out in our favor. Let me explain. Notes from the Underground is not just a psychological novel. It's also a satire of Russian society at the time. In particular, Dostoevsky attacks the influential work of Nikolai Chernyshevsky. The Russian Revolution was looming, and this cultural climate was reflected in Russian philosophy at the time. Chernyshevsky was a utopian socialist, and his main work, a novel by the name of What Is to Be Done, would become a hugely influential work that is widely seen as anticipating the Russian Revolution. Dostoevsky attacks, or rather satirizes, these utopian ideals through the character of the underground man. Many of the irrational behaviors of the underground man must be seen in this light. A main theme of the novel, for example, is that humans will sometimes act irrationally, completely out of spite, or even for no reason at all. Famously, the underground man says that he wants to have the freedom to say that 2 + 2 = 5. In all likelihood, Dostoevsky wanted to satirize with this irrational behavior the utopian idealism present in these socialist writers who theorized about utopian futures for mankind where everyone would act rationally and in their own self-interest and paradise on earth would be achieved. Dostoevsky puts against this vision the thesis that even if we somehow achieve the perfect society, then still humans will act irrationally, they will commit crimes, or they will be otherwise imperfect citizens merely out of spite, just because they can. Because ultimately, they have the free will to do so, and there is always a pleasure in the forbidden fruit, in doing the prohibited, even to your own detriment. Nietzsche greatly admired this psychological insight of Dostoevsky's into the human condition. But what he probably didn't recognize was this satirical aspect, how Dostoevsky lampooned the utopian socialists of his time who dominated Russian intellectual life. For Nietzsche, Notes from the Underground appeared to him as an exclusively psychological novel, a deep dive into the mind of a troubled man. But for us, who have more information available to us than Nietzsche ever had, Notes from the Underground is also somewhat a political or a cultural book. It's not Nietzsche's fault, however, because many aspects of the translation completely obscure this dimension of the novel. For example, some Russian terms are completely mistranslated, so we miss connections to Chernyshevsky's work. Entire passages are left out, lines are omitted, etc. The new edited text would be misread by anyone because the translator purposely removed this aspect of the novel because he thought that the French reading public wouldn't get it anyway, and it would just confuse them. But this doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, because now Nietzsche can focus completely on the psychological aspect of the novel, and that is where he thought Dostoevsky was at his best anyway. The erratic behavior of the underground man, in Nietzsche's interpretation, is now based completely and utterly on the human condition and nothing else. Whereas in Dostoevsky's view, the erratic behavior of the underground man is at least in part a component of the satire of the broader culture. This changes how we look at the underground man. The daring question to ask is, did Dostoevsky understand his own work? If we could somehow travel back in time and tell Nietzsche about all of this, that there is also a cultural and political dimension to the novel, that it's also a satire, he would probably reply that it doesn't matter, because Dostoevsky painted a portrait of an existentially troubled man who violently reacts to the deterministic universe around him as he tries to assert his individuality and freedom. The fact that Dostoevsky wrote at least part of his behavior off as satire would only diminish the force of his psychological portrait. For Nietzsche, the underground man is not a satire. It's an authentic portrait of a man struggling with his place in society and in the universe. After Nietzsche mentioned Dostoevsky several times in his work, and recommended him to friends, people even began reading Dostoevsky with fresh Nietzschean eyes and discovered new psychological depths to these characters that they perhaps wouldn't have discovered otherwise. Similarly, it's entirely possible to have a Nietzschean interpretation of Crime and Punishment, even though Nietzsche never read Crime and Punishment, and Dostoevsky, of course, knew nothing of Nietzsche. That's the beauty of these great ideas. They provide perspectives and ways of thinking, and they discuss the human condition in such ever-fresh ways that we don't need to be constricted by historical events. They all go back to the same source, the universal human condition. Nothing stops us from analyzing Ivan Karamazov from a Nietzschean perspective. It's not like the literature police will come and arrest you. All great works of art touch upon similar topics and subjects and ideas, and so it's only natural for us, when we look back, to put two and two together when we analyze them. So to circle back to the start of the video, we don't need to know which books of Dostoevsky Nietzsche read. We don't need to know exactly when and where and how he discovered Dostoevsky. Ultimately, these questions don't really matter, except maybe to historians. When Nietzsche accidentally discovered Dostoevsky in a bookshop in France, he didn't discover Dostoevsky at all. He discovered some botched French version of Dostoevsky, but he still called him a psychologist of the first rank, and even though he only had a limited understanding of Dostoevsky, he still found something valuable in there. And even better, because his information was so limited, his interpretation wasn't clouded by an overbearing historical and cultural context, and he could focus on what he thought was important, the psychology and what it means to be human. And indeed, ever since people have started to learn about the strange historical contingencies of Nietzsche's discovery, and when it became clear just how much the French translation butchered the original, it gave rise to a whole new way of looking at Dostoevsky through Nietzschean eyes. And now we are here in the 21st century, and these men still speak to us today. And sure, we will get things wrong, and we will view thinkers through mistaken historical lenses, and our information might be limited, but we can still find beauty and meaning in what has come down to us. And at the end of it all, that's the best that we can hope for. Thank you for watching. This video would have been impossible without the support of our Patreons. If you still want to join their ranks and get access to a dozen exclusive videos, mostly dealing with topics that are too spicy for YouTube, go ahead and take a look at our page. Follow us on Twitter too, if you're so inclined. And with that said, again, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.